Okay, gonna attempt a video on the functionality of the noise box. Even though it looks daunting and complicated, it's really not. It's pretty simple. It's just very repetitive. The functionality of the box is basically it's all about oscillators, and oscillators are found all over the place. Really, tuning fork is an oscillator. It's designed to resonate at a specific frequency. A bell is a good example of a oscillator. A metronome is a great example of an oscillator. So in this situation, the oscillators are what you call a Schmitt trigger inverter, which isn't too complicated. They have many uses in electronics, but by utilizing the feedback loop in a Schmitt trigger inverter, you can make an oscillator. So the oscillators are all on this board here. There's two hex Schmitt trigger inverter ICs. Each IC has 6 Schmitt trigger inverters on it. So let me get out a schematic here and show you what's happening. So in the electronics world, we have capacitors and resistors. A capacitor holds a charge, and a resistor will drain that charge from the capacitor. So in a Schmitt trigger inverter, there's a feedback loop, and it's very simple. The capacitor charges up until it's done charging. When it's fully charged, due to this feedback loop, the charge in this capacitor will drain across the resistor. And when it's drained, it charges back up again. Then it discharges, and it charges, and it discharges, and it charges and discharges. And that's what gives you this frequency. By being able to vary the discharge rate of the capacitor with a variable resistor, we're able to vary the frequency of this oscillator. So the magic of the noise box comes from the whole synchronization principle. Okay, so there's 2 oscillators that are meant basically just to be synchronization oscillators. So through these diodes, which are actually backwards in this schematic. Some of my schematics need to be changed a little bit. They're not perfect because I did change some things as I was building it, but for the most part, this is it. So by synchronizing any of these oscillators together, you get that warble effect. So when 2 oscillators are tuned together perfect, it'll sound like one frequency, but as soon as you vary one of them just a little bit, you start getting that warbly effect. So if this one's double this one, then that's a harmonic, and you get harmonics every time you double something. So that's where the whole magic of the noise box comes in, is being able to independently vary the oscillations on any of these oscillators and independently vary the oscillations on the 2 synchronization oscillators, and being able to do that all over the place all at once makes the thing so noisy and so insane and so crazy. So that's a basic description of the oscillator circuit board. Also on the circuit board is the third IC is just a driver for the LEDs. There's two LEDs in the photo Vactrol oscillator. So the photo Vactrol oscillator has um, a photo resistor, a light sensitive resistor instead of a variable potentiometer. So this one is dependent on light, and then there's two LEDs that are driven that stimulate this. So I'll get into that when we get into the only other thing on this basically is the schematic is Q1 here is for the sequencer oscillator. So the sequencer oscillator is set up a little bit differently because of the homemade potentiometers. I bought pots for all these. At the point in time when I did the sequencer, I built the potentiometers out of some spark plug wire, and I'll explain that later. But the this one operates a little bit differently. So the input from the sequencer is coming into a transistor, and this one's more of a this oscillator is more of a electrically controlled oscillator. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But that's basically this schematic. So I'll go back to the box. Okay, so back in the box, I'm going to work my way from left to right here and try and make sure I don't miss anything. So this is the Vactrol oscillator. And the two LEDs are mounted on a slide, so you can slide them back and forth. That changes the values of the oscillations. The sequencer, these are the homemade potentiometers. Are basically there's a spark plug wire in here and a copper wire, and then there's this copper or this brass wiper wipes across the spark plug wire. You get these two like this, and that's basically a homemade potentiometer. So the okay, so I'll get it in there later. The sequencer, I'm able to turn on each channel as sequencer on and off. There's also a push button to operate each channel. This is an amplifier. It's out of a tape deck. You got the amplifier and the speakers. I think it might have been a CD. I think it was an old CD player. Basically everything in here except for these red switches and the potentiometers on that board. Everything else is from scrap electronics boards. I've got boxes and boxes of old boards. You can see where I've cut some IC chips out of the board, and so at any rate, then again we got the oscillator board here. These are basically all the caps. These caps are for the oscillators. These caps all in here are for the sequencer. Again, the sequencer, you can change the pitch with the potentiometers, but then there's also, it gives you a really broad range on switching in banks of capacitors in and out. Down in here, I've got this is the circuit board for the sequencer, which I'll get out in a little while. And then obviously the switchboard has 6 voices on it, and then the keyboards. The keyboard has another that's for the keyboard oscillator. So I'm going to take these two out. I had a request. Somebody wanted to see the back of that board, so I'm going to take these two out, and I'll get back to this. Okay, so this is a switchboard. It's basically just if all the switches. You have a push button switch and a like a push button and then a always on. What do you call it? Always on switch um, in parallel with each other. So either way, it's triggered. Um, this is the potentiometers from the last schematic. These are the oscillators over on this board that's way over here, and the switchboard's over here. So there's wires going back and forth. The diodes are in there, and this is the schematic for the keyboard, which basically it's the same thing. Instead of having variable resistors, there's a resistor for each key, and they vary. Each one is a specific value, and they vary. I figured them out with a piano tuner, a piano tuner and an oscillator in the beginning, and then so that's the two schematics, and then the boards. So the keyboard has this little thing to hold the keys from flipping up, and then under the keys are those banks of resistors and all the switches for the keys. They're all made out of wood. And then the switchboard is that's about it. There's a bunch of potentiometers and a bunch of switches. They're all color coded. I have a chart of the wire, all the colors. So that I could keep track of who goes where, and they're all different color wires. So that's that, and put it on pause here and get on to the next thing here. Okay, so we got our 6 oscillators. We got a switch for the photo resistor. Have adjustment pots for the LEDs, 2 switches to turn the LEDs on, and then a bank of switches to sync either 1 or 2 with each of the channels. The keyboards have a fine, of course, and a fine adjustment. Keyboard syncs the keyboard in. So if I do 2 voices, and I can tune the 2 of them together here. And they sound there's 1, there's 2. There we go. Still get a little bit of warble, but so at any rate, that's that board, the keyboards, and I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to try and get a good description of the sequencer in, but I'm trying to make this video short, so I'll be right back with that. All right, the sequencer. I'm not going to get into a big electronics lesson here. The sequencer is probably the most complicated thing in the noise box. It basically consists of 2 shift registers, and they shift a pulse, a square pulse, round and round in a loop. And they depend on the clock there's a clock. One of the oscillators on the oscillator board is a clock, and so that clock is feeding a pulse into this into the shift registers, and it's basically just high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low, 5 volts, 0 volts, 5 volts, 0 volts, 5 volts, 0 volts, and that loops around and around. And there's a input here for either a high bit or a low bit. So there's 2 switches on the sequencer, one to put data in and one to take data out. So that's as deep as I'm going to get into it with the shift register. It's just basically it's making a loop. So that enables me to turn on and off the relays on the sequencer. So the data from the shift registers turns on and off the relays on the sequencer through these 2803 Darlington arrays. And again, I'm not going to get into it, but they're basically driving the relays. The shift registers themselves can't be used as drivers to drive the relays. So this is basically the same thing as using a small relay to drive a big relay. And so in the schematic, you can see the Darlington array chips, and then there's the LEDs that light up, and then there's the relays, and then each one has a potentiometer. This is the homemade potentiometers here, and then each one has a diode, so that if more than one of them is on at the same time, it doesn't interfere with the functionality of the thing. So that's as deep as I'm going to get into all that, because again, I don't want to do a big electronics lesson. So the sequencer itself is basically made out of all wood. The circuit, the chips for it are down in here. You got the 2 shift registers, and then the 2 Darlington transistor arrays, which were surface mounted, and I left them on the circuit board. So it's kind of a rat's nest of mess, but that's the sequencer circuitry. And then the functionality of the thing, basically here's a switch for to input a bit into the sequencer. So I can do it manually. Let's take this bit out. You can do it manually, and you can change the pitch with the pots. But since I don't have a lot of variation here with the pots, there's also the banks of caps, so I can get some super bassy, so bassy you don't even really hear it. So if we get a bit going in here, you can speed it up, slow it down. So you got the switches, and then there's the relays back in here. Obviously the LEDs lighting up, and then all the caps. So that's about it. that's about it for the functionality of the noise box. Hope this video was a little helpful. At least it's kind of basic, but again, I'm not going to get into a big electronics lesson, so see ya.